Good afternoon, everyone. I'm not sure if there's anybody left out in the lobby, but if you would come on in now, that would be great. It's really such a delight to see all of you here. This has been an event that has seen many months of brainstorming, planning, and preparation. And it's just such a gift to see you here. There are countless folks to whom I owe debts of gratitude. But I especially want to thank Ruth Trigg and Annie Dempson for their administrative support, Derek Taylor for jumping into the game at the bottom of the ninth inning as the best closer that a friend could have, as well as President Scott McQuilkin, Provost John Pell, Joe Creech, and the Lilly Network, and the Weyerhaeuser Advisory Board for all the advice and encouragement along the way. I also want to thank all of the plenary speakers for being here this week. Each one of you has been a dear friend and a fellow traveler along the way in the world of higher education. And what a strange, enriching, frustrating, life-giving, and increasingly complex world that is. I'm not going to dwell right now on all of the challenges and crises facing higher education, and particularly Christian higher education. Over the next couple of days, however, we'll have occasion to think constructively about how to address a series of challenges, including declining birth rates and enrollments, the rapid growth of artificial intelligence and ChatGPT, increasing political polarization, and so on and so on. But really, my greatest hope for this conference is that each of you will find new friends and fellow travelers of your own in the plenary conversations, in breakout sessions, in communal worship, and over a shared meal or a cup of coffee. There are many reasons to be cynical or pessimistic about where higher education might be heading, but in my experience, the best antidote to this cynicism is the sort of friendship that begins with a mutual recognition of shared loves. And if we're lucky, that friendship cultivates an intellectual intimacy that gives us reason to open ourselves to new ideas, habits, and values in the good company of our friends. And this is really what Christian higher education at its best can do for a human soul. I fell in love with the writings of Augustine when I saw my teacher, Eric Gregory, take delight in the North African bishop's prophetic critique of the lust for domination. I came to understand the relationship between Christian theology and the idea of justice when immersed in the writings of Nicholas Walterstorff. I found a new appreciation for the grotesque beauty of Flannery O'Connor's literary world when talking with my friend Jessica Hooten-Wilson. And I had my moral universe shaken when I was assigned to read Gustavo Gutierrez and James Baldwin for the first time. My former teacher, Jeff Stout, once told me that one of the most important things a teacher can do is simply to point to something and say, "Look, notice this. This is something true, or something good, or something beautiful. In this moment, let it hold your attention." So yes, Christian higher education faces many challenges, and we're going to be talking about many of them over the next 2 days. But deeper, more lasting questions are on the table for discussion as well. Some of these questions we'll put up here. How can we cultivate the sort of intellectual and spiritual community in which our students will encounter what is true and good and beautiful? If we are claiming to offer a Christian education to our students, are we forming them in ways that are substantively distinct from our secular peers? How might we draw on our Christian identity and values to address injustices in our own communities? In the midst of difficult times, what common objects of love sustain us in our work? Who are the friends who might awaken us to new objects of love? And finally, how can we slow down our frenetic, anxious, social media-obsessed minds enough to pay attention when a friend or mentor says, "Look, notice this"? These are habits of mind, body, and soul that I hope to see develop in my own students, and these are habits I hope that we can begin to practice together during our brief time here at Whitworth. So once again, I'm grateful for each one of you for being here, new friends and old ones. Before we officially start the conference proceedings and being mindful of the idea of Christian formation that pervades the program ahead, I'd like to open us with a prayer that Thomas Aquinas once wrote for his students. So if you would just bow your heads and join me in prayer for 1 minute. Come, Holy Spirit, divine creator, true source of light and fountain of wisdom. Pour forth your brilliance upon our dull intellect. Dissipate the darkness which covers us, that of sin and ignorance. Grant us a penetrating mind to understand, a retentive memory, method and ease in learning, the lucidity to comprehend, and abundant grace in expressing ourselves. Guide the beginning of our work, direct its progress, and bring it to successful completion. This we ask through Jesus Christ, true God and true man, living and reigning with you and the Father forever and ever. Amen. I spoke briefly about the importance of friendship in this conference, and in that spirit, I'd like to welcome up Joe Creech, a dear friend of mine, who's I've asked to share a bit about the work of our co-sponsor, the Lilly Network of church-related colleges and universities. So, Joe, welcome.
Thank you so much, Davey. It has just been an absolute pleasure to know you and to keep working with you, and I'm excited about this conference. I already feel, hopeful. Just seeing that list of things, it's exciting. I bring greetings to you from the Lilly Network of church-related colleges and universities. I have the privilege of serving as executive director of that organization, and on behalf of our founding director, Mark Schwain, our program director, Jenna Van Sickle, our associate director, Joe Goss, and the 102 schools, including Whitworth University, that make up the Lilly Network, I want to welcome you in friendship to this wonderful conference. We've had the privilege of helping to sponsor this, and Davey has asked me just to tell you a little bit about the Lilly Network and what we do. So the Lilly Network was founded in 1991 or 1992. We're still not quite sure, somewhere in there. And its goal, ever since its founding, which we are sure of, has been to strengthen the quality of church-related higher education. We do this primarily through two ways. The first is by fostering conversation and collaboration and really connection at conferences like this. We offer grants. We offer you Lilly Endowments money in the form of grants to sponsor programs like this that bring people across the sector together, people from different schools, to think about how to strengthen church-related higher education. Or we offer grants to our network schools to do these activities and foster this conversation on their own campuses. The second thing we do is develop leaders for church-related higher education. We do this also by offering grants to schools for faculty development and leadership development and different opportunities for professional development on their own campuses, but then we also run 3 fellowship programs, one for graduate students, a postdoctoral fellowship at Valparaiso University, which is the home of the Lilly Network, and then a program for mid-career faculty, our faculty fellows program. So you can read about those opportunities on our website. And let me just add, I think at the very heart of what we do is a commitment to building interdisciplinary and ecumenical friendships. And so what we're doing here, essentially, is what we really try to do. This, as Davey said, is a tough time for higher education and for our sector especially. It's challenging times, but I hope that we will go away from this meeting renewed, inspired, edified, and refreshed in our hope for the work that we do, in the life-giving work we do with our students. So thank you so much, and Scott, I think you're to take it over now.
Hi, my name's Scott McQuilkin, and I serve Whitworth as its 19th president, and I've been invited to just offer some quick words of welcome. I'll express some gratitude, and then I will do the formal introduction of Jamie Smith. So what a thrill for us to be hosting this at Whitworth, all-star cast of speakers, panelists, and we know that there will be many more people in addition to who are here over these next couple days participating, and so we're so grateful that you are here. And I'm looking so forward to learning from all of you and the responsibility that we have at Whitworth for helping to shape and provide a Christ-centered education for our students. When I visit with prospective students and families, I share with them about this place and refer to this as a becoming sort of experience for our students, helping our students who bear the image of God become more of who Christ meant for them to be for the world. And that when they walk across that commencement stage, that they're the kind of people who, when they leave here, they have equipped in all those ways, socially, spiritually, relationally, intellectually, so that whatever space they occupy in the future, they will bring a redemptive arc to those spaces, whether they're vocational, civic, family, or church. And so thank you for what you are doing here today to help us learn more to do that at Whitworth University and the institutions that you serve. I want to also extend some thanks to, where's Davey Hendrickson? So what a gift he is to Whitworth University. I think I broke protocol 2.5 years ago when Davey was interviewing. He was in my office, and partway through that interview, it's just supposed to be a vetting process. I believe I turned to Davey and said, if you get offered this job, you just have to take it. And I'm grateful, Davey, that you did. To the Lilly Network, thank you for your support. Thank you for being here. Bob and Andrea for the support that you provided. So thank you. Now, introduction of Jamie Smith. Jamie, I'm a fan. So my fall convocation address in 2022, I cited Jamie Smith. My installation address in October of 2022, I cited Jamie Smith. So if there was anything worthwhile that I said, it was made far richer because of your contributions, your scholarship, and your thinking. So thank you for that. James K.A. Smith is professor of philosophy at Calvin University, where he holds the Gary and Henrietta Biker Chair. As a scholar, Smith has embraced the vocation of being a translator of philosophy for wider audiences. As a cultural critic and commentator, he explores the tensions of modern life, inviting readers and audiences to more intentional practices of faith and flourishing. He is the award-winning author of a number of influential books, including Desiring the Kingdom, How Not to Be Secular, reading Charles Taylor, You Are What You Love, The Spiritual Power of Habit, On the Road with St. Augustine, and most recently, How to Inhabit Time, Understanding the Past, Facing the Future, Living Faithfully Now. He is currently at work on a book about contemplative spirituality and contemporary art. Smith served as editor-in-chief of Comment Magazine and Image Journal. His essays and criticism have appeared in magazines that include The Christian Century, Christianity Today, America, Harvard Divinity Bulletin, Lit Hub, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. His writing has also been featured in outlets such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the USA Today. Jamie and his wife, Deanna, are empty nesters who live in the Heritage Hill neighborhood in Grand Rapids, where they tend sprawling flower gardens and an ever-increasing number of bird feeders. Well, let me close this introduction by sharing a few snippets from how key reviewers have written about his works. Jamie Smith's work is rich, readable, searching, provocative, theological, and practical. Meat and bread to satisfy the earnest and postmodern seeking soul. Of unrivaled depth and texture, a patchwork of wise reflections, a journey into the greatest journey of all, and a work to retain as I pilgrim. Please welcome Jamie Smith.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you so much. Very kind. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a treat to be here. Davey, thank you so much for pulling together a wonderful mix of communities and constituencies, asking challenging questions, but also hopeful questions. And it's really a treat for me to actually get to hang out, especially with my other fellow plenary folks who we've been meeting on Zoom, it feels like, for 1 million years. And now we finally get to be here in person. So it's great. Davey's sort of theme and questions that he's been posing, you've been kind of cooking this up for a long time, I feel like. And I think they are such timely questions that I just had to sort of like bring, in the Pentecostal church, we would say, this is new manna. That is, this is all new. I'm just thinking out loud with you here tonight. But I'm trying to start the conversation that we will all have over the next couple of weeks. Let me make sure oh yeah, it does, okay. See, that was a spoiler. We'll see. So we are gathered to reflect on questions for the next generation in Christian higher education. Our endeavor then is to interrogate the future of Christian colleges and universities. But our animating question here is not just whether there's going to be a future for Christian higher education. Really, the questions we're asking is, why do we have Christian colleges and universities? Why do we be? What's going on? What is it about Christian higher education that is distinctive and worth pursuing? What do Christian colleges and universities offer not only the church, but a wider world that they might need? So let me suggest a thought experiment as a maybe bracing way to get at the existential valence of these questions. I've long been fascinated by a thought experiment Alan Weissman entertained in his remarkable book that was called The World Without Us. He says this: picture a world from which we all suddenly vanished. Actually, it's funny. If you're an evangelical, you can easily picture this. But it's not all, it's some. It's like, whoop. Picture a world from which we all suddenly vanished. Imagine some Homo sapiens specific virus that somehow eliminates us and leaves all else intact. Look around you at today's world, your house, your city, the surrounding land, the pavement underneath, the soil hidden below that. Leave it all in place, but extract the human beings. Wipe us out and see what's left. How would the rest of nature respond if it were suddenly relieved of the relentless pressures we heap on it and our fellow organisms? It's easy enough to picture, I think, the impending ruin of our most monumental accomplishments if we follow this through. In the time lapse of our imagination, right? Angkor Wat crumbles, the Duomo in Milan topples, and the Netherlands is reclaimed by the sea. Runways and roadways are swallowed by vegetation and prairie. The miles of copper and wire in our subway systems erode to these slim ochre seams in the soil. Paintings that have been preserved in climatized galleries begin to peel and fray. Every Matisse dissolves to dust. And the yearning of Bach's cello concertos is never heard again, just wind blowing through F-holes in warped instruments overrun by vines. The world without us. But Weissman does not leave us in this apocalypse of oblivion. Instead, he raises a further and more interesting question. Even after that, he says, might we have left some faint, enduring mark on the universe, some lasting glow or echo of earthly humanity, some interplanetary sign that we were here? Indeed, is it possible that instead of heaving a huge biological sigh of relief, the world without us would miss us? So, here's my thought experiment. Thinking about Christian higher education. Imagine the world without us. I realize that this is jarring and uncomfortable because actually this feels less and less outrageous for Christian colleges and universities. And I don't mean to be flippant. I think this feels less and less like a hypothetical thought experiment and more like an extrapolation from existing data. We are already seeing the crumbling, and some of us have already walked through the first ruins. I want to name the precarity and risk the discomfort of this exercise precisely because I think it is an existential question. Only by framing it in this way might stakeholders come to prize what has been taken for granted. So, to distill what is essential about Christian higher education, imagine the world without us. To jolt ourselves out of the doldrums of bureaucracy and to bring to the surface our why, imagine the world without us. To discern whether Christian higher education deserves a future, imagine the world without us. Imagine the church without us. What's lost? Look at the church today. Can we see in it, in Weissman's terms, any enduring mark of Christian higher education? Do we see in North American Christianity any echo of Christian colleges and universities? What would the church lose if we weren't here? If our Christian colleges and universities no longer existed? Imagine this country without us. What would the wider world lose if we weren't here? Are there ways that Christian colleges and universities contribute to the flourishing of society, even if those dents and echoes are not acknowledged? Are there ways that, I'm going to run with a metaphor here that I shouldn't because I don't know anything about science. Are there ways that the biome of the church depends on Christian higher education for nourishment? Are Christian colleges and universities essential contributors to the ecosystem of American society in some way? Or are we easily forgettable? Would we be missed? Imagine the world without us. Would we be missed? I feel like I have to be honest. I think these are open questions. I think that's precisely why we're here this weekend. The answer to these questions is not simply a matter of recounting the past accomplishments of Christian higher education. In fact, I would suggest that if we only have the past of Christian higher education to go on, the answers might be more negative than we would like. We must reckon with our histories, but thanks be to God, we are not only our pasts. We and our institutions should be encouraged by a beautiful reminder. I just read this recently from The Cloud of Unknowing. Do you know this mystical work from the late Middle Ages? There's this beautiful line. It is not who you are or what you've been that God sees with his merciful eyes, but what you want to be. That's not a bad logo for a conference on the future of Christian higher education. It's not who you are or what you've been that God sees with his merciful eyes, but what you want to be. I think this is precisely the time to ask these questions and entertain this jarring scenario, because I think the conditions of threat to Christian higher education are also conditions of opportunity. I want to invite us to think dialectically about our situation. What I mean is, the moment that feels like an implosion is also the moment for renewal. It's an opportunity to create new forms that take up what is best from our legacies while also overcoming and canceling what deserves to be left behind and sometimes repented of. So let us not be institutions that are well lost. We have the opportunity to become institutions that would be missed. So, what does it look like to offer a Christian higher education for the life of the world? Let's first begin sort of fundamentally. What is a Christian education for? I, like many peers of my generation, although I'm slightly unsettled that I think I am the senior speaker on this slate, which is, I'm just kind of grappling with some reality checks in my life. Like many of my peers, I am deeply indebted to a prior generation of Christian scholars who bequeathed to us an ambitious, capacious, imaginative vision for a faithful life of the mind. I've spent 30 years pursuing this vocation because as a 20-year-old would-be pastor, I happened across Alvin Plantinga's landmark essay, Advice to Christian Philosophers, in the musty basement of Midwest Bible College. I have made my home in faith-based colleges and universities, others in the Lilly Fellows Network to begin my life at Loyola Marymount. I've made my home in faith-based colleges and universities because Mark Knoll and George Marsden painted pictures of an endeavor that felt challenging and meaningful and communal in the ways that Davey alluded to. But over the decades that some of us have answered this call to the outrageous idea of Christian scholarship, as George Marsden put it so wonderfully, it seems to me that logistically and bureaucratically, Christian colleges and universities have been racing to become Jesusified redoubts of the status quo. We thought we were building Christian Harvard, or at least Protestant Notre Dame. Am I right, Baylor people? But what we ended up with too often looks more like DeVry with a chapel. 30 years ago, my mentors had me dreaming about ambitious centers of learning and scholarship that engaged fearlessly with the questions our neighbors were asking. Now, I look around and see swelling business schools unsettled by anything that happens in Bible class, with students praying earnestly under the scrolling glow of an LED stock market ticker. Sorry, that hits a little close to home. It seems to me that this sort of education, which largely credentials ethical actors to play in the fields of late capitalism, might be the sort of education, honestly, that wouldn't really be missed. Why? Because you can get it anywhere and everywhere. Just go to the local state university and add a little young life on the side. Done. And it's happening. That's where we're losing. Over this same period, I have also realized what I didn't learn from Plantinga and Knoll and Marsden. And what I'm still learning from scholars like Barbara Omalati and Lamin Sana and Willie James Jennings and Justo Gonzalez and Cheryl Sanders and Jonathan Tran and so many others. What I'm learning about the complicity of our institutions in systems of exclusion and injustice, about the narrowness and bias of the questions that animated our scholarship. Questions about the future of Christian higher education must begin with a reckoning with our past and then imagine how and why Christian institutions could be uniquely poised to build something different, beginning from confessional honesty and working towards restorative justice. So, to our question, what is it about Christian higher education that the church and world would miss? What sorts of Christian colleges and universities might the world need in the future, even if they don't realize it? I think what is most distinctive about the project and vision of Christian higher education is not that such an education adds God, if you will, to the course catalog. Rather, what makes Christian higher education indispensable today is the fact that we understand the human. The education and scholarship fostered by Christian colleges and universities is, or should be, an educational vision that recognizes and values the fullness and complexity and utter uniqueness of human beings, precisely because our faith primes us to recognize the echoes of divinity within the human. What makes Christian higher education indispensable in the wider ecosystems of the church and the world is our, what Davey has called our unique charism, to bear witness to the irreducible wonder and heartbreak of being human. Our colleges and universities are, or should be, or must become outposts of the true humanism that alone can make sense of our culture and our unique place in nature. And by the way, if you sort of like were raised in the 70s and 80s, and whenever you hear the word humanism, you think secular humanism, just kind of let that go. And I want to remind you that J.I. Packer wrote a book called Christianity, the True Humanism. So before you throw me out, Christianity is the true humanism. And this is, I think, what really, really, really defines our colleges and the kind of education that we have to offer. Christian institutions, then, have this unique place in this ecosystem. See, now I went off script. So, we become outposts of this true humanism. Of course, it is precisely the biblical story and theological frame that primes us to be such humanists. A Christian social imaginary primes us to recognize human beings as those distinct creatures who, in Henri de Lubac's wonderful formulation, have a natural desire for the supernatural. That's what makes us human. So let me invoke, I want to do just a little bit of teaching this afternoon, if that's okay. I want to invoke a metaphor, strange metaphor, from Blaise Pascal. Do folks know Blaise Pascal? I think of Pascal as a kind of precocious, visionary mathematician and philosopher from the 17th century. And his most generative thinking comes down to us, actually, in really what is just a bundled collection of scribbled notes that was the idea for the book he never wrote. And so because it's just this jumbled collection of thoughts, his book is just called The Pensées, the thoughts. And in a couple of places in the Pensées, he describes human beings somewhat cryptically as thinking reeds. Thinking reeds. And I want to hang with this strange metaphor for a few moments. So let me give you a couple doses of Pascal. Thinking reed. It is not in space that I must look for my dignity, but in the organization of my thoughts. I shall have no advantage in owning estates. Through space, the universe grasps and engulfs me like a pinpoint. Through thought, I grasp it. This is a dated language, of course. Man's greatness lies in his capacity to recognize his wretchedness. A tree does not recognize its wretchedness. So it is wretched to know one is wretched, but there is greatness in the knowledge of one's wretchedness. Big Calvinist energy here, almost. But he was a Jansenist. He was basically a Catholic Calvinist. But we'll come back to it. Ultimately, I think this is affirmative and celebratory. But Calvinists love wretchedness. One other passage, then we'll meditate on this a little. A human being is only a reed, the weakest in nature, but he's a thinking reed. To crush him, the whole universe does not have to arm itself. A mist, a drop of water is enough to kill him. But if the universe were to crush the reed, the man would be nobler than his killer, since he knows that he's dying and that the universe has the advantage over him. The universe knows nothing about it. All our dignity consists, therefore, of thought. It is, claim. All our dignity consists, therefore, of thought. It is from there that we must be lifted up, and not from space and time, which we could never fill. So let us work on thinking well. That is the principle of morality. Okay, everybody with me? I find the juxtapositions here are fascinating, and I think they're very generative. Pascal is trying to capture this wondrous paradox of the human. The reed is fragile and vulnerable, easily crushed. The reed is humble and insignificant, a blip in a cosmos that swallows it. Like the reed, human existence is one of jeopardy. Our very dependence makes us susceptible to almost anything. And so such weakness and insignificance seems like the very antithesis of dignity, doesn't it? But the reed thinks. Here lies dignity and greatness, Pascal says. The wonder of the fact that we are the beings who wonder. We are those incomprehensible specks in a vast cosmos who nevertheless are the only ones with the audacity to try to comprehend it. We are dwarfed by the scale of the universe, and yet we are those invisible pinpoints who can carry an entire universe in our minds. The black hole spewing energy 7.5 billion light years away regards me with a cold indifference, but that's because it lacks regard. It is unthinking. It dwarfs us, but we see it. Here we are looking, puzzled and marveling, wondering and asking. This, says Pascal, is the distinguishing dignity of the vulnerable human, our capacity for thought, for reflection, for wondering, for understanding. Which is also why injustice and evil are so heartbreaking and offensive. We are the beings who understand we're being crushed. We are those creatures who, precisely because of the wonders of consciousness and thought, are aware of our vulnerability. And so a paradoxical feature of our nobility is that we understand our suffering, and we know some of it should not be. We are also those beings who are haunted by a longing for a transcendence that we cannot achieve on our own. We crave immortality even as we are all too aware of our mortality, which, by the way, is why Pascal says we distract ourselves incessantly from the fact that we can't fix this problem. Very, very timely analysis. I find this, I might be geeking out here a bit, but I think this is a really evocative way to encapsulate the distinctive humanism that should be, or in our best moments has been, central to Christian higher education. I think it's also an understanding of humanity that is waning in the age of late capitalism and techno-feudalism, both of which have captured higher education's ecosystem over the past 40 years. I think an education for thinking reads is an education that in some sense maybe only Christian institutions could offer. But I think an education for thinking reads is also what the whole world needs. This is why I think the current crisis and challenge for Christian higher education arrives at the same time as a unique and historic opportunity. If we are or become institutions that understand when we are. I think the challenges for higher ed and Christian higher ed in particular are, of course, varied and multi-factor. I don't want to pretend there's no silver bullet here. But at least one primary challenge that we face is an increasing instrumentalization of higher education as mere credentialing for globalized capital and finance. If education is merely a means of cranking out able, ethical workers for the so-called knowledge economy, then we have already severely diminished the dignity and richness that Pascal was talking about. While we might rightly be concerned about things like the specter of transhumanism or whatever animates us today, let's not lose sight of the forces that eviscerate human fullness through the ubiquitous reductionism of a market-centered imaginary, concerned to make human beings into little more than reliable producers and consumers. This is the most quotidian form of dehumanization that we all swim in today. The dehumanizing forces of late capitalism have been more destructive of human dignity and transcendence than whatever agenda currently bothers Christian media. Indeed, it is on this, I will say that again, it is on this score that I fear Christian higher education has not only been insufficiently resistant, but positively complicit. Now, Christian colleges and universities have been unable to escape the social pressures that approach higher education in these terms, as a commodity that secures participation in the economy, right? What I'm saying is education itself has been overwhelmingly commodified and therefore it has a certain function for us socially and morally almost. For reasons I'm going to discuss later, I think Christian colleges are uniquely susceptible and vulnerable in a world where higher education is itself turned into a market, and where the point of an education is to become well-equipped participants in the market. Because when this happens, it's inevitable that a college education is now evaluated in terms of ROI, return on investment. It also means that colleges and universities become marketers themselves, selling an education to consumers rather than inviting learners into a way of life. And as many of us have witnessed, slowly and inexorably, this grind turns our institutions into one massive admissions division that happens to have a few classrooms attached. Our institutions are reduced to strategies of survival. And again, I'm going to talk about why that is the case and why I'm sympathetic what's going on here, but I want us to just name what's happening. Our institutions are reduced to strategies of survival, which means selling a product, promising returns on investment, so that what? Students can become ethical, conscientious, sanctified consumers and producers. This is like a political system where politicians are only always campaigning and never governing. The entire university is now enlisted in selling a product and only secondarily, sometimes it feels like, offering an education. I wish this were hyperbole. I see the heads nodding in this room. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, so far, the challenge and threat. How could this possibly be an opportunity? Two audacious reasons. First, we know better. What I mean is this. I think we are at a key point where those of us captivated by a more expansive, meaningful, properly humanistic vision for higher education can see the problem and still hunger for a different way. We didn't sign up for Christian higher education so that we could become part of a machine that cranks out cogs for the global technological Frankenstein that is our economy, even if we send them off with Bibles. Our own discomfort with what our institutions are becoming is a hopeful sign that we haven't been eaten by the beast. Do you know what I mean? Does this make sense? Our disappointment and frustration is a healthy sign that we have both a memory and an imagination for how this could be and should be otherwise. In fact, in good Pascalian fashion, our dis-ease and alienation is a sign that we want more. One might even say that our ability to see the wretchedness of the situation reflects our dignity and hence the hope that it could be otherwise. So what I'm trying to say is, first reason why I think there's an opportunity is it's still not too late. A second reason for seeing an opportunity in the threats, and this is admittedly a wager, a pitch, a wager. Did you see what I did there with Pascal? I just thought of that. This is an educated guess. I think there is an opportunity here because I think there is something ineradicable in human beings that is beginning to bristle at this reductionism and instrumentalism. Across the ecosystem of higher education, one hears rumblings that fumble toward a question that is something like, is this all there is? Is this what we're doing? And you can hear faculty asking that question. Sometimes you can even hear administrators asking that question. That's a joke. It's a joke. But you can also hear young alumni of our institutions, burnt out in their late 20s, asking the same question. Just as a fun little data point, a couple weeks ago, I did a Veritas Forum event at Vanderbilt University. The theme was, is there more? 250 students packed a room and stayed for an hour afterwards for conversation. And these are very, very smart, elite students at a school like Vanderbilt, and they're and by the way, about half of them are not Christians. And they're like, is there something more? They want us to ask this question. and they're surprised that university isn't the place where it gets asked. Fascinating. Let me cite a micro example from contemporary discussions about artificial intelligence, yet another looming threat for higher education. This is an example to me of where we might be approaching the nadir. Is that the bottom? Zenith is top, nadir. We might be approaching a nadir, which could be a turning point. In a fascinating essay about the outsized hopes and apocalyptic fears around artificial intelligence, Justin Smith-Rue, who teaches at the Sorbonne, welcomes the quantitative instrumental reasoning power of large language learning models. Rather than worry that machines will take over what humans do best, calculative thinking, instrumental reason, Smith-Rue suggests that this onslaught might actually liberate the humanity of human beings. This is what he says. The AI revolution might afford us a perfect opportunity to stop treating human beings like information processing systems and to start treating them like human beings. In other words, the success of our machines could break us free of the machine metaphor of the mind. Fascinating. What would be the alternative picture? And by the way, Smith-Rue has no religious sensibility or stakes whatsoever. What metaphor might better highlight and celebrate the unique human capacity for thought? His reply, attention. Attention. What if some other capacity were to be centered as the most characteristic of what it is to live or to think? What if, for example, the information processing metaphor for understanding the mind were traded out for some other capacity that in other settings has been seen as most characteristic of a thinking being? Attention, for example. The capacity to attend, one might argue, is something that cannot be treated statistically, or at least it's not obvious that it can be. And attention, unlike information processing, also seems to have little to do with problem solving. When you stare at a work of art for a long time, for the optimally powerful experience of it, you would do best to come to it without any particular problems in mind, to empty yourself out and to wait and see what the work has to offer you. To empty yourself out and see what the work has to offer you. Big Meister Eckhart energy. You notice you're opening yourself up to something else. I think this distinctly human capacity for attention is like a late modern echo of Pascal's point. We thinking reeds, we vulnerable humans, are those creatures with a capacity for thinking that finds expression in wonder. It's no mistake that Simone Weil once said that attention taken to its highest degree is the same thing as prayer. To liberate humanity as those beings with the capacity to attend, to wonder, to inquire into the why of things without instrumentalizing such wonder, that is to understand humans as the ecstatic creatures oriented to God that we are. So, Christian education that recovers an appreciation for the vulnerability of humanity, as well as the thrill and dignity of thinking, would be a means of grace, I think, to the wider world. It would be a means of grace that would invite students and the wider world to face our brokenness, even the peculiar wretchedness that besets us because of our unique awareness. Such an education would invite learners to resist distraction and instead listen to those infinite hungers we can't efface, but also can't satisfy on our own. It might even break us open to grace. So, an education for thinking reeds is another way to sort of just concretize this picture of an education in Christian humanism. Well, what does that look like? What's a curriculum look like? How is an education for thinking reeds reflected in curriculum? Just as a completely preliminary sketch, I want to highlight three features. First, being human takes practice. A Christian higher education, animated by incarnational humanism, will be an approach that understands education as a project of formation and not just the dissemination of information. I've said lots about this elsewhere. Here, my point is that this is already a countercultural starting point in the realm of higher education. The Christian affirmation of the dignity of thinking reads affirms two things at once: that every single human being bears a consciousness that's capable of becoming divine. Sorry, I've been reading the Eastern Fathers for a bit. That might freak some of you out. It's okay. Of realizing remarkable capacities for thinking and understanding. And it says that these capacities have to be realized, right? So humans are created with this majesty and dignity, but they're not done, right? They don't come, we don't come out fully formed. This takes process, this takes practice. We are those marvelous monsters called humans, and in another sense, we are called to become human in the fullest sense. The German forebears of a lot of our American university models talked about this in terms of Bildung, cultural formation, a cultural formation that unleashed and shaped distinctly human potential. We can talk about maybe just in terms of formation. I think it's crucial to recognize that such formation is holistic, communal, and ritualistic. Get over it. Liturgical, maybe we could say. It will be attuned, it's a kind of education that is holistic because it's attuned to mind and body and their intertwining. Such a formative education aims to train our desires as much as our beliefs. Yak, 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 desiring the kingdom, blah, blah, blah. This is why such an education, this is important, is not only restricted to the academic division. It's also why I think Christian colleges and universities are really primed to be incubators for this kind of holistic formative project, precisely because we intuitively grasp this holism. In my experience, it's faith-based universities that entertain a possibility of alliance between the student life division and the academic division. Most other universities, those are two entirely different worlds. At faith-based Christian colleges and universities, we understand, oh wait, no, this is all a part of one project. That's a huge, huge opportunity for us. We grasp that the residence halls and gymnasium are as formative as classrooms and laboratories, maybe more. We know coaches shape student character as much, more, as professors. A Christian college education, then, is a formative season in a young adult's life. It's a hinge moment for their development as human beings. An education for thinking reads appreciates both the divine fullness we are made for as well as our precarious vulnerability. As such, I think a formative education should emphasize then two grand themes or foci, and these are the other 2 points. Second, it should be an education where formation is for virtues attuned to vulnerability. What do we mean? Part of the holism of Christian higher education finds its expression in explicit concern for the formation of virtue. An important way, and we won't get into it, but virtue doesn't mean like teaching the kids to follow the ethical rules, right? It's cultivation of character and dispositions. In an important way, Christian colleges and universities can pursue this unabashedly because the ethos and identities of our institutions allows us to be explicit and specific about what we envision as the telos of human flourishing, right? Famous line from McIntyre's After Virtue, I cannot answer the question, what should I do, unless I first answer the question of what story am I a part? Right? In other words, there's no sort of coherent possibility of a virtuous life and therefore virtue formation if you can't be explicit about what you think human beings are supposed to be. If we can't do that, there is no reason for us to exist. Right? That's why we are. That's why we exist. But this still leaves open the question of which virtues we aim to foster. An education for thinking reads, I suggest, there's no way this is going to catch on, by the way. It's kind of fun for tonight, but it's not. There's no bumper sticker potential in this. An education for thinking reads, can you imagine the college mascot? We are the thinking reads. Crushed regularly on the field. An education for thinking reads will be an education that is particularly interested in fostering these virtues that are needed by vulnerable creatures like us, as well as the virtues that enable us to care for the rational, dependent animals we call our neighbors. Dependent rational animals is another little formula from Alistair McIntyre, which I think is really rich for these conversations. So we want to cultivate virtues for beings who are vulnerable, but we also want to cultivate virtues for us to care for the community that is vulnerable. This is precisely why Christian education should be at the forefront of naming, identifying, and resisting patterns of social life that ignore, abuse, and run roughshod over the vulnerable. We thinking reads, doomed to awareness of our own fragility and vulnerability, should be shaping humans who are especially attuned to the wretched of the earth. Here's one of the ways that future generations of Christian scholars might be less fixated on questions of epistemic outlook and access, and more concerned to pour our reflective capacities into discerning and understanding and resisting all the ways late modern society exploits the vulnerable and treats human beings as expendable. In short, all the ways that the systems and structures of late modern society dehumanize. And honestly, I'm just setting up the rest of my colleagues for the next 2 days, because you're going to get to hear more about this from scholars who are doing exactly that when you hear from Beth Allison Barr and Jonathan Tran and Malcolm Foley and others. In this respect, it's hard not to hear an important echo of Pascal's language in the scriptures. What I'm encouraging is a Christian educational vision that reflects a distinctly incarnational imaginary. We human beings live at this paradoxical fulcrum of vulnerability and dignity, embodiment and reflection. But even more incredibly, the Christian story attests to the God who comes to inhabit the same space of vulnerability and majesty. The entire endeavor that we're talking about is animated by the King of the cosmos who took on the form of a suffering servant. And the prophet Isaiah tells us of this incarnate God: a bruised reed he will not break, and a dimly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. If Christian education is a humanism, it is a humanism that finds the fullness of being human in the human face of God, in Jesus, the suffering servant who tends to vulnerable reeds with gentleness, and therefore is a fierce and faithful advocate of justice. If you want to know what Christian formation is aiming for, look to Jesus. Third aspect of this curriculum for thinking reads. It's a formation for a capacity for critical reflection. There's a little bit of a backstory here, which is, so I wrote this book called Desiring the Kingdom, which is all about this formative project, and I emphasized how an education is not just about like intellectual ideas, it's about the cultivation of virtue and stuff, and it was shocking to me how many people thought I didn't care about thinking. So this is my retort, okay? This sounds, I know, ridiculously obvious and cliche, but let's not forget that an education for thinking reads is an education in thinking. But what do we mean by that? How does this matter? By an education in thinking, I don't mean, of course, an education that merely bequeaths a body of beliefs or teaches young people what to think. I'm talking about, that's what I got at my Midwest Bible College. Here's the list of things. I'm talking about an education in which students learn how to practice thinking and engage in the tightrope walk of reflection. An education in thinking is a repertoire of practices that enable students to realize, develop, and hone now our distinctive human capacity for reflection and understanding. What we're really talking about here is the elevating, transcending practice of becoming self-conscious. Becoming those exceptional creatures who not only think, but even think about our thinking. Who reflect on how we've come to conceptualize the world and others and God, and ask ourselves whether those concepts are illuminating or obfuscating. So much more can be said here, but let me highlight just one facet of why I think such an education in thinking is liberating. And hence, one of the things that makes the liberal arts liberal, that is, freeing. So, Pascal distinguishes humans, in those quotes we saw earlier, from mere nature, right? Remember he says, a tree does not recognize its wretchedness. An animal is not aware that it's going to die. So, the human capacity for thinking and reflection is what distinguishes us within and from nature in some ways. And as the German philosopher Hegel would put it, this capacity for awareness and recognition of our situation in the cosmos is what places us then in the world of culture that emerges from and is no longer subjected to merely the forces of nature. So think of it this way. To become a thinker, to become reflective, is liberating precisely because we begin to recognize how things work and the contingency of the systems that we inhabit. So we are no longer merely immersed in nature. We get insight into nature's operations, and then we begin to harness them for human flourishing. Hello, refrigeration. Probably one of the greatest cultural accomplishments in the history of humanity. Or at least we use our reflection and understanding to grapple with nature and to understand its operations and at least protect ourselves from nature's patterns. Thank you, bricks and concrete. But, and this is crucial, and this I think is the most timely sort of moment, we also begin to realize that all sorts of patterns of human community are not forces of nature that are merely given. When you become reflective and you learn to think, what happens is with the power of reflection, we begin to realize that the institutions of culture, the family, the state, the economy, the church, are all the result of human formation and not just divine fiat. Which also means that they are contingent and revisable, reformable. Hello, Protestant Reformation and the revolutions of early modernity. By means of rational reflection, we recognize humanity's incredible power and responsibility for shaping patterns of social life. We also realize our failures in this regard. And we begin to imagine ways to reform them. The cultural world is a world that is made, and it is made by us, which is also why it can be remade by us. When human beings fail to realize this reflective power, this capacity, when they fail to emerge in a way into culture, they remain humans who still respond reactively to the world, instinctually, almost like animals. The world just is the way it is, and we have to conform to how things are. It's like the fatalism of what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Do you know what I mean? It's the way things are. What are you going to do? That is not dignity of awareness and consciousness. We remain, when we don't know how to sort of think and recognize these things about what we ourselves have made, we remain servile. And especially servile to those human beings who see through this and then leverage it to their own advantage. The failure to realize this human capacity, reflection, and culture is a recipe for servitude and exploitation. This is a free footnote. So if Percival Everett's James does not win the Pulitzer this year, I'm burning everything to the ground. Do you know this novel by Percival Everett James? It's in a sense, it's a retelling of Huckleberry Finn from Jim's voice. Every single one of you should go read it this weekend. It is an absolutely astounding novel. And what I would say it embodies is that actually, James, the enslaved character, knows and understands and is more reflective about the world than his owners or his masters, because they think this is all just the way nature dictated it. James knows the world is made and needs to be remade. It's a really, it would be a great college read, by the way. I think it's fantastic. Why belabor this? Because I think this partly explains the sad assimilation of so much of North American Christianity to forces that seem to me the antithesis of the biblical vision for human flourishing. I think that too much of North American Christianity has failed to realize the liberating power of reflection, and so it's succumbed to a curious mix of fatalism and magical thinking. Lacking reflective capacity to understand the history and contingency of our social institutions, too many Christians merely react instinctually to various forces, and at the same time, they fall prey to the illusion and false promise of a strong man who they imagine arrives with some sort of divine mandate. It's sort of like lapsing back into pre-modern conceptions of the givenness of the political order. It's like a return to the divine right of kings, but this time as farce. In this regard, it's very hard to see much salutary effect of Christian higher education on our electorate. I'd be happy to have an argument about that, but that's what worries me. And education in thinking and reflection is an exercise in empowering human image bearers of God to get some distance from nature, not in terms of Gnostic rapture, but in terms of not being instinctual reactors to a given order, and instead being empowered participants in the formation and reformation of culture. It means waking up from our slumbers and not lapsing into the default of consumers and producers, which makes us little more than animals who eat, buy, and scroll Instagram. Okay. Can I go a little longer? You're getting nervous. Okay, let me. I have a whole section on Christian scholarship that I'll just say quickly. We need the university to be the think tank for the church. Why is scholarship and research crucial for church and world? Because we are spaces and places and communities of scholars who can think and ask questions that are not being asked elsewhere. And the church actually needs us to ask those questions for it, even when it's not happy that we're doing so. Okay, let me come to a conclusion. In closing, let's go back to our opening thought experiment. Imagine the world without Christian colleges and universities. Would we be missed? I've tried to highlight those facets of Christian higher education that should make us indispensable contributors to the wider ecosystem of the church. Thus and so, the philosopher's idealism, a lovely manifesto to open a conference. And then I hear the president saying, and then what? We return from here and all of our conversations still scrambling for enrollment, fighting for students, hacking at our budgets just to survive. So, a needed dose of realism. Let's not give up hope. Let's first recognize another reality of this ecosystem. We are not the ones who need convincing. The people who show up to a conference on the future of Christian higher education are not the ones who need to be persuaded. So true. And so I come back to a point I mentioned earlier. I think the vulnerability, the real institutional fragility and vulnerability of our institutions is reflective of a particular history. I think what has become clear over the past 40 years is that our institutions have always been vulnerable. They were undertaken as acts of beautiful risk, living on the edge of their constituency's capacity and willingness to support and fund them. And it worked as long as we had gobs and gobs of 18-year-olds looking for seats in college classes. The vulnerability that has come out is it's always been baked into our model. So, one of the key questions for the future of Christian higher education is very tangible. Will patrons arise who see our institutions as outposts of hope and possibility, as essential countercultural endeavors for which the human is at stake? Can we find stakeholders willing to see this as a generational project? And can we win them as allies to this endeavor? I'm reminded of a remarkable line from the nature writer Barry Lopez in his book, Embrace Fearlessly the Burning World. We are searching for the boats we forgot to build. Such an insight into human nature. What I want to say is, we've got boats here in Christian colleges and universities. At least rafts. We could improve them, no question. But in some sense, the genius and gift of the ecosystem of Christian higher education is a flotilla of boats that aim to ferry humans to the fullness of their calling. But to be brutally honest, tuition dollars will never be adequate to pull off this audacious endeavor. I just think we have to start saying that and being honest about it. What will it take for us to win over stakeholders who want to set sail with us? And then I'm reminded of another line. It's a favorite quote of mine from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. If you want to build a ship, don't drum up people to collect wood, and don't assign them tasks and work, but rather teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea. Perhaps therein is a calling for Christian scholars as public intellectuals, or what Cornel West calls organic intellectuals. How can we teach our fellow wayfarers to long for the endless immensity of the sea? And how can we convince them to help us build the boats we all need? I suggest we make our case by being more distinctive, more prophetic, more unapologetically committed to the project both church and world needs. An education for thinking reads, an education in wonder, care, and love. Thank you.
Now, about 30 minutes left for some Q&A and some conversation. Of course, there'll be plenty of chance to continue conversing over meals and across the weekend, but let's get that started now.
And if I can just say, this is the beginning of a conversation amongst us, so don't feel like it has to be questions to Jamie, but it's starting a conversation.
Thank you, Jamie. That was, my mind is racing from the comments and the argument and the extraordinary imagination that you're offering. I was thinking when you're talking, on the one hand, I don't think I've ever felt so excited to be a university administrator. I also think I feel, at the same time, I don't think I felt as depressed to be a university administrator. Particularly the accounts, the 3-point account you have of how this curriculum could go. And I really feel like I wish you were able to give us the Christian scholarship part of that. But that picture is so, so beautiful. It is certainly the boat that we wish we had. My question for you is the financing of that. You've given us a picture of why the financing that is currently the reality of the American university and why it's not sufficient for that. In fact, it'll run roughshod right over it. At the end, you gave a gesture of patrons who could do this. I can't help but be skeptical that those patrons become patrons by way of the very capitalist logic that you are worried about that's writ large all over the university. So my question is something like this. What if I were to say to you, I was trying to think the part of me that was excited as a Christian administrator is something like, what Jamie has given me is the incentive to try to imagine the political economy that would be necessary to produce this curriculum. what makes me depressed is I was trying to think, I don't think I can imagine it.
Yeah.
Until I thought, I can think of one political economy. It's called the church. I want to ask you, when you hear that, do you think I lack for imagination for Christian education? Or do you think I have too much imagination for the church?
No. Thank you. I mean, you've zoomed right in on, but this is great because it's very concrete. So I think you're right that in some ways to just invoke patronage is to not adequately yet interrogate where the resources of how and where the resources of such patrons arises. Now, that said, two things. First, I think that there are all kinds of Christians who I'm trying to think how to do this carefully. There's I'm happy to let some people clean their conscience by becoming patrons of an endeavor that is in some ways fundamentally challenging the structures that benefited them because they might also have discomfort with it. So that's one way to think about it.
It's what Davy's teacher, Jeff Stout, refers to in terms of endowed chairs in universities. He calls that money laundering.
Yeah, money laundering. Right. But when you say the church, what I think you're saying is, can we think of this on a more collective level where, of course, then this is where, well, where is this church? You know, it's the great critique of the Howard-Wassian church. Oh, this church sounds amazing. Where is it? I'm happy to work piecemeal and ad hoc for encapsulations or embodiments of the church doing this on some scale. One thing that seems to strike me is, so many of our Christian colleges and universities grow out of very, very distinct, like denominational constituencies and things like that. That means every one of us actually kind of has our people, right? And maybe I don't have to convince the American church. Maybe I start by saying, can we, as maybe I do think this is a task for us as Christian scholars, can we spend some time articulating why we think this is like a kind of life and death endeavor for the human? And can we make that now almost like a missional pitch for why the church as a body and institution would want to invest in that? And see, maybe we start there, right? We start in little encapsulations of the church at smaller scale, and then it starts, again, I'm so glad. One thing that heartens me is that someone like you is an administrator. Honestly, like, may your tribe increase. And I think you're probably at a hinge point of contact between worlds here that you'll be able to think about this much more concretely. Yeah, thank you. I don't know who's calling out. I see a hand here.
So thanks so much for this. Just terrific stuff. I think this notion of character education resonates with several of us in this room. So I've got a question that has sort of been haunting me as I've been thinking about this sort of in my own pedagogy. And it's this. So this character education movement that's sort of starting to take shape, it's terrific, but it's the kind of thing that I see people like Martha Nussbaum embracing for reasons that don't have much to do, with Christianity, which is okay. It's good to have lots of different allies. But I've been haunted by the question, okay, what would Christian universities have to do differently if we discovered tomorrow that Jesus were never raised from the dead? And if the answer is not much, I worry that we're in trouble. So
That's
Can you
that's a very different thought experiment than the world without us, right? So I mean, to connect those two things, the character education endeavor and the specificity of the resurrection and ascension of Jesus. This is precisely why I think you're right. Character is kind of hot, sort of in the higher ed sector more broadly. I do think that there are systemic challenges of that being very effective in institutions that aren't, in a way, permitted to specify a particular substantial vision of the good of the human. But that's not us, right? That's not our institution. Now, what I hear you saying is maybe you worry that functionally and practically we've just kind of taken an off-the-shelf telos. I think, by the way, one of the ways that that often happens is under the rubric of excellence, right? We decide, well, this is what educational excellence is, and by that what we mean is we at the Christian university want to look as good as the state university down the street or whatever it might be. And then that is a recipe for assimilation to a kind of mushy, non-teleological specificity. I do think Christian colleges and universities has to be constantly having an internal dialogue about how we specify the substantive vision of the good that we are forming students toward. And no surprise, I think McIntyre is a helpful resource in doing that. You know, is it in After Virtue where he says, look, you can say you're doing an education in virtue, but which virtues make a difference and which virtues you celebrate depends on the story that you're telling. And so you can have Benjamin Franklin virtues or you can have martyr virtues. And obviously ours should, I think what you're saying is, have we kind of veered towards Ben Franklin virtues or, you know, something sort of generic. Again, I want to be sympathetic and say, I get that when our survival just depends on getting butts and seats, you can see how we are tempted to sort of slide to, it's like, okay, we don't get crazy kind of thing. I think there's a way to be thickly Christian and robustly hospitable and pull off I think that would be a better way to think about it than a sort of like dimming down of the specificity. Yeah, it's a good question. In the middle. Thanks.
So, Dante uses the reed at the...
Sorry, Glenn, say that one more time.
Sure.
Dante,
the poet, uses the reed at the opening of purgatory because he has to bind himself with the reed of humility. Can you address humility as one of the qualities necessary for this kind of education?
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, that would be a great example of one of the substantive virtues, right? That we need to be fostering, and to not let humility be confused with false humility, which I think is a real temptation, especially in kind of like Christian nice sort of circles, right? Like we confuse humility with not being ambitious. And I actually don't think that those are mutually exclusive. I don't think being ambitious is being arrogant. Intellectual humility is also a big part of this project, and I think that's what we communicate when we talk about wondering about the world, right? We are trying to, I think our power and the dignity of the human capacity for consciousness and reflection and thinking is remarkable and incredible, but we also always want to keep getting to the frontier of it and recognize the limits of it so that we stand in awe. Interestingly, I think sometimes the sciences tend more in that direction some days than we do in the humanities. So I think humility would be a great example of one of those distinctive virtues that I don't know, does like Eastern Washington, are they going to sign up for humility? I don't know. I don't think so. I don't mean to. Is that a school? Is that a school? Yeah. I'm not picking on anybody. Yeah, great question.
Yeah, Jamie, this is Jeff.
Jeff.
Here, yeah. Great talk. Thank you so much. Lots of nodding in my head. I just want to ask you to invite you to explicate a distinction that I think is latent, but maybe undeveloped, between the kind of commodification or the sort of technocratic mentality that you critique at the beginning and the critical reflection you talk about at the end. So how is a Christological critical reflection, how might that discipline the same sorts of, oh, everything's reformable, nothing's given, I can remake this after my desires, right? So how do we, talk about critical reflection without just becoming technocrats?
Could it be, if I'm tracking with you, could it be one of the ways that would play out pretty distinctively as a Christian critical thinking, if you will, is that it would also always be disciplined by eschatology. And in that sense, it would be reformist, but never utopian, right? Because it could never just conclude to a simple confidence in our own human capacity and ingenuity to right everything. So there would always be a discipline of our critique would never be, it shouldn't be attended by the illusion that we were going to set up the perfect institution. The critique would be ongoing, right? Like everything we would do would be. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't, I'm thinking about this dialectically in the sense that, you go through it and then you realize the failures of what you've come up with, but you also sort of figured out, okay, but we can't go back to this. I think one of the great temptations in Christian higher ed and a little bit of scholarship right now is to sort of articulate a critique of the failures of sort of modern cultural institution building and then become nostalgic for a past. I think nostalgia has no place in the Christian story. I think remembering does, but I think that's very different than nostalgia. And I think the ongoingness, am I tracking with you? Is that
sort of like Charles Taylor. Is this what you're thinking? Like, yeah, okay.
Yeah, in some ways, that's right. By the way, I think that has a lot of like edge to it, right? Like if you do that, you are bound to disappoint people on left and right, if you sort of think that way. Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. All right. Derek, you're in charge.
Have some semblance of order here. We'll go over here. And please do share your name and your institution. Yeah.
Oh, great.
Hey, Joseph Clare, George Fox. Good to see you, Jamie.
How you doing, man?
It's a delight. I was waiting to hear. I mean, Desiring the Kingdom feels so long ago. It's a beautiful book and kind of a
15
heyday.
years.
Yeah, kind of a high watermark in terms of the Christian intellectual energy and enrollment numbers at many of our institutions, and was waiting to hear where you're at and what you're thinking now. So
I'm revising it next semester, actually.
Okay, good.
So I'm working on a second edition, which it remains to see how radical that revision is.
Well, it's a gift you'd apply your creative intellect to these big questions that touch all of us. So thank you. I think one thing that strikes me is that maybe the intellectual and economic model of our institutions has been built on and kind of free road on a pre-existing model of Christian formation and education and a demography connected to denominations, ways of life that have been evaporating and changing dramatically, right? So therefore, as we move into whatever the post-Christian apostolic, world is going to require of us after Christendom, we do have to accept that our mission is a Trojan horse sort of mission of appealing to whatever interest is there around career preparation. And the surprise inside is transformation, right? You didn't know it was coming, but out we came with transformation. So we have to be the attachment and the apparatus to the admissions jobs machine, but it's not jobs in Jesus, it's transformation. But so the question is the model the scholarship think tank that we need patrons for, or is it an older model of Christian intellectual energy applied to evangelism, formation, catechesis, preaching, a very like basic kind of project that we have to bring people from the very ground up into the world of the Christian intellectual life?
No, I mean, I don't have an answer except to say that's a great, I think you're right. This goes back, maybe one way to build a bridge is how to think of our institutions a little differently going forward, as not institutions for securing the safety of the young Christians who leave home, but rather as a radical invitation to the adventure that is this Christian vision and life, which then can equally have a missional invitation to a wider world. And I know our colleges are already welcoming students, right, who do not identify as Christian, who have not grown up in the church. I think your point about, like, let's stop doing what we're doing, assuming, 1970s and 80s youth group kind of paradigms. It's like, no, we are in the 3rd century, right? We're in the 4th century. Look at what, I'm going to use this term, but it's not meant as an insult. We are doing catechesis amongst the pagans, right? That is thoughtful, engaged, somewhat elite people who are finding and looking for opportunities. What does it look like now to invite people into an education that is actually an invitation into a way of life that they wouldn't have known? Actually, David, I'm not going to tell the story, but he told me a great story of this happening at Whitworth with him now. I think in that sense, throwing off our old formative paradigms that kind of, have an evangelical stamp on them, and imagining a much more mission. I then think we can become very ambitious, right? The trick is to do this in a way that, again, is both thickly particular, but also hospitable. And I just think that that's also the challenge of the church today. So in that sense, we could think with one another. Yeah, that's a feeble response to a very generative line of thinking.
Hi, I'm Luke Cawley from Dordt University. I was enjoying it more when you didn't have to say where you were associated, but here I am. I keep thinking about making T-shirts that say "Educate, don't indoctrinate." I love the think tank idea. I think it's great. I think that there are a lot of parents that are very concerned about sending their children to think tanks.
Yeah.
Right? And I don't know. I'm not concerned. Like, I would love to send my kids to hang out at a think tank. That sounds like fun.
Yeah.
How do we deal with that?
It's a great question. I mean, by the way, I also think to put these two things together, what I'm envisioning, and this was honestly my experience when I went to Calvin 22 years ago, is you could either say it was the best of both worlds or it was the worst of both worlds, it was the worst of both worlds in the sense that you had all the teaching obligations of like an intense, small liberal arts college, and you had R1 kind of aspiration research expectations. What I'm picturing is, in an ideal world, yes, we are a think tank because our teachers are scholars who are doing original reflection and research and asking new questions in new ways, but they are also engaged formatively and I hope pastorally in the care and formation of their students. I think what you're getting at is something that's important, and this is, I think, a role for the Christian as public intellectual, not just writing to other academics, but writing to wider audiences. How do I win those parents to a different vision of the adventure of being Christian and the fullness of being human? This is why I'm saying this is a generational project, because I know exactly what you mean. The parents who are like, no, I want to know exactly what Johnny's going to be told, and I don't want Sally to be exposed to this. And I heard this guy maybe has them read Karl Marx, and it's like, no, it's like, dude, this is an adventure. In a way, it's on some of us to try to reach the church, which is where parents are sitting in the pews. That's not going to happen next year, but I think this is sort of By the way, I think there is a huge, huge vacuum between Max Lucado and Princeton University Press books. Do you know what I mean? Like there's this huge gap, and I think it's a vacuum where if more of us can sort of find the opportunity and ambition to speak into that vacuum, it's our only shot, right? It's our only shot. I don't know how else we will hope to change those parents' minds. Yeah.
All right, well, let's plan to keep this conversation going.
Oh, yeah.
Join me now in thanking Jamie.
Thanks. Thank you.
I just want to offer a few announcements here. Well, first, my name is Derek Taylor. I teach theology here at Whitworth, and I've been helping Davey organize this conference the past month and a half. If you have any questions or any needs while you're here, please don't hesitate to let me know. Now we have an hour for dinner. Our hope is that meals can be a time to keep this sort of conversation going, to deepen and create some friendships. Many of you have purchased meal tickets already. If you have, they are behind your name tag. If you have not yet purchased meal tickets, you are welcome simply to pay for meals in the dining hall as you walk through. Our dining hall is in the Hickson Union Building, the hub. If you walk out to the main walkway and head left, you will walk right to it. We have reserved our upstairs room in the dining hall, which we have very cleverly called the Crow's Nest, because we're the Pirates. We could have been upper room, but we went with Crow's Nest instead. But the Crow's Nest is just for this conference to keep this conversation going, so you can get your food down at the bottom. As you walk in all the way to the left, there's stairs up to the Crow's Nest. We're a little bit tighter for our meal time tonight than it will be for other meals, because at 7 p.m., the Porter's Gate is here, which we're really privileged to have them here. Of course, the task of formation happens in the classroom. It happens more fundamentally probably in worship, and so it happens there in the chapel and here in the lecture hall. It's a shared project, so we're excited to have the Porter's Gate be part of this weekend. That begins at 7. I know that our students here love the Porter's Gate, and I suspect there'll be a lot of them there, and so I suspect that our chapel might be full, or relatively full. So if I were you and I were wanting to be part of the Porter's Gate thing, I would get there 10 or 15 minutes early to grab a seat. And okay, that's tonight. Tomorrow morning. This is all in here and on the website. But let me tell you this. Tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., coffee and continental breakfast will be served at the chapel across the lawn here. And then at 8:30, also at the chapel, Isaac Wardell of the Porter's Gate is going to lead morning prayer. And then after that, at 9 o'clock, the first round of breakout sessions begin. And then at 10:30, we are back here. You guys got that? Okay. Like I said, it's all in here. But let me say a prayer for us as we disperse. Gracious God, we come before you with hearts full of gratitude for bringing us together tonight. I pray as we head toward dinner that you would meet us around the table. Bless the food and the conversation and the friendship. May you use it all to strengthen and clarify our sense of mission as Christian educators. And may all that we do be to your glory and for your kingdom. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.